Okay, so no secret, power demand in data centers rising rapidly, and I guess the AI explosion is one of the main reasons. From your perspective, I guess it'd just be good to understand just why energy has become such a critical strategic issue for operators today, but yeah, bear in mind the landscape, what's going on.
Well, I mean, hopefully I'm not beating a dead horse, but it is pretty linear, right? In terms of how data centers operate, sort of the correlation of compute, and I'd actually throw in maybe a third bucket, correlation of compute, cooling, and power, right? And if those are like sort of the three horsemen of like data center growth, right? There's an opportunity to optimize and correlate all that stuff. I'd say historically, within these sorts of environments, they haven't been fully like, compartmentalized together. And so they've been sort of doing things sort of on their own route. And that's why you see a lot of underutilization and sub-optimization of, those three primary categories.
Okay, and I think it's fair to say even before the current sort of boom
Mhm.
fueled by AI, a lot of data center companies were already acknowledging the need to use more renewable energies, but potentially struggle with the on the implementation side.
Mhm.
So what are the particular technical barriers preventing you might call effective renewable integration into
Mm.
existing data center infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, like whether it's data centers or other folks, I think historically with renewables, a lot of it is just due to, just intermittency of like the consistency of, just the baseline load. There's also historically elements of like pricing, right? Is it really, is it competitive, right? When it comes to powering up a massive operation. And I think that's more sort of in the past though, right? I would say that you're seeing a lot more where grid scale, utility scale, solar farms, and other situations like that, best systems, things like that, are actually, an opportunity to provide, some redundancy, provide some risk mitigation, but also just in general, right? It's just one of those things where I think we're in an environment where, no source of power is off the table, right? It's just the issue of like, how quickly can I get access to it? And does it align with my SLAs and just, maybe uptime requirements and things like that? And, again, one of the bigger things I think is really just the ability to roll out storage is really a good way to kind of mitigate some of those, historically, risk factors. And, I think you're seeing a lot of that going on. And at least from our perspective, we see so much activity. And the flip side now is that hey, if there is opportunity to bring in renewables or behind the meter generation and things like that, what is the new problem, right? And now it's supply chain, right? And so, we're opening up a new can of worms, but fundamentally, a lot of folks, a lot of smart people are working on it, and hopefully we can resolve it pretty quickly.
Okay, and in terms of the energy landscape, why isn't simply building more energy capacity, whether it's what we might call fossil fuels, traditional sources, or
Mhm.
renewables, a sustainable long-term solution sort of on its own in terms of meeting data center power demand? I mean, clearly
Mhm.
there's got to be some expansion, but I guess there's maybe not enough power out there. So yeah, it's maybe not as simple as just building out more power. Is that right?
Well, I mean, if you see a lot of these forecasts, right, we're talking forecasts of like required power and then the mix of overall power mix to, I mean, what, 10% of total power consumption in the US, by 2030? I forget, I get all the numbers mixed up, but it's massive, right?
It is
And
big,
so
yeah.
I think, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, regardless of what market you're talking about, right? So, what I would say is, some of the issues that need to be discussed are, time to power, right? So, and that drills into two sort of camps, right? Which is, should all this additional power that are funding and powering data centers be grid connected, right? And there's obviously lots of sort of like regulatory issues, but also there's NIMBYism, there's also pricing elements, and like, does that affect the actual ratepayers? All these things that need to be worked out. But fundamentally, the question is, how quickly can you power up a data center that's connected to the grid? And, I think that's been one of the major bottlenecks, maybe points of controversy. And so if we agree that it just can't be that fast, or if there's ways to become faster through flexibility, these are things that the industry needs to work through. Now, the flip side is for folks that are saying, hey, we don't have the desire to wait 5 years, right? Just to throw out a number, which is probably pretty consistent with what people are saying. So we're going to just do it ourselves. We're going to basically create a gigawatt, data center behind the meter. We're going to power it up with like gas turbines or whatever. We're going to have storage and things like that. The thing about that then is like, that's like building your own sort of grid, right? Behind the meter, because it's so massive, right? The second thing I would say is the CapEx spend on that is, in the billions, right? That's a massive undertaking. It also has its own lead time issues, right? So question is, are you really shrinking 5 to 7 years down to what? Maybe it's 2 years. That 3 year, 4 year gap probably pencils itself out because the productivity you get by lighting up a data center faster, all works out. All the finance guys have figured that out. Now, the thing about that then is, the question would be, does that data center ever decide to kind of rejoin the grid at some point? And some people say yes, some people say no, but I just look at it like when you're making that level of investment, right? And you get really good and you basically are self-generating, power this data center up, and there are no issues really in terms of SLA violations or uptime requirements, things like that. Why would you go back to the grid, right? Like, and that's where I don't have an answer and I don't know. My guess is like you really wouldn't. And what ends up happening is that it just allows for folks to say, we need to find real estate, right? We don't technically need to be grid connected, but now we have to focus on supply chain, right? And we need to focus on storage and maybe even renewables and things like that, right? So I would say those are a couple of issues on the power side that I think are very meaningful, right? And it could really divide how data centers are built. Um, and I think I answered your question, but those are, I think, maybe high level, and I'm happy to drill down a little bit more if you'd like.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just on the renewables side.
Mhm,
Clearly, the intermittency is the given us
mhm.
the main problem with that, particularly for data centers, which require constant uptime, reliability, etc. But bearing in mind what's going on in the Middle East, do you think there's going to be more acceptance that maybe even fossil fuels aren't quite as reliable as everyone thought
Mhm.
they were, therefore more of an interest in renewables? And I guess sort of I suppose the question is how practical are renewables? Because I don't think data centers rely on them exclusively, but can you see a future where that might be the case with storage, as you suggested, or do you think renewables always be treated with an element of suspicion because, as you say, if the wind doesn't blow or the sun don't shine, there might be a
Mhm.
problem.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think I would be that pessimistic about it, right? Because I think the thing about it is if we're having this conversation and the data center boom was happening 10 years ago, where I think the infrastructure around wind and solar wasn't as robust, supply chains weren't as firm, then yeah, I think the pessimism was well deserved. I think we're in a situation now where like, assuming that the development has been made and large hyperscalers can contract directly with these producers. And again, adding in a best system and storage for redundancy and to be able to dispatch appropriately. I think it's a very meaningful thing. But it goes back to, again, the fact that you just can't light up that generation overnight, right? And we're talking in, years, maybe decades, right? From a siting, development, activation perspective. And so part of it is really understanding if there's capacity out there from solar and wind, grid scale type stuff, does it pencil out to basically use that power to basically create a data center, behind the meter, to manage it the way that you would do it with a traditional grid connected version of it? And I think the answer is yes, right? I think we're ready for that. So I wouldn't discount renewables from the equation. It's just a matter of like making sure that, location wise and the accessibility to it is all there and the power requirements are there. So.
And I guess I mean the suggestions, the sort of SMR, the small scale nuclears, has a
Mhm.
similar sort of, I won't say marmite, but yeah, obviously the word nuclear conjures up sort of maybe some negative thoughts, but clearly are a lot of people think that's a way forward, and I think different countries, regions are yeah, moving at a different pace, shall we say? But do you see that as being quite an important element of the mix into the future? And again, as you say, off grid because you can create your own sort of small scale nuclear plant next to the data center without having to plug into the grid.
100%. Very bullish about it, right? I think it's another incredible renewable resource, right? That could also light up. data centers that don't have to be that massive either, right? It could be very modular. It could be a stepwise approach in terms of saying, hey, here's the first 50 megawatts. Here's the next 100. Scale up to kind of daisy chain a much larger data center versus trying to build a gigawatt on day one, right? But I think the thing with that technology, whether it's the application of it, the safety elements of it, things like that, still there's some lead time, right? And I mean, at least what I read and what I see, and I'm no expert in the SMR space, is that it's kind of similar in terms of lead times when it comes to like a traditional grid connected data center, right? It could still be anywhere from 3 to 7 years out, if not even longer, depending on market, right, and regulatory. So I think these are the investments that we do need to make to kind of create sort of a broader mix of solutions to power these different data centers. But it doesn't solve the immediacy of where is the power coming from, let's say in 6 months, right? So, yeah.
And I know you speak about the need for intelligent energy orchestration,
Hmm.
which I guess is in simple terms getting the most out of what are currently your current supply, if I've understood correctly. So what
Hmm.
does it mean in practical terms for a data center operator when they're managing potentially multiple power sources? What does intelligent energy orchestration mean, and what does it deliver?
Yeah, I mean, from my company's perspective, right? There's probably two or three things that we really think about, right? I'd say the first thing I would say is, a lot of these data centers are, sort of beholden to very strict SLAs, right? So the five nines, if you're, hear that in the industry a lot. And so the thing about the five nines too is that it actually creates sort of an artificial underutilization of the assets to create a massive amount of headroom, right? And I think the reason why, and to keep it as simple as possible, is that when we're sort of evolving into more traditional enterprise compute to AI compute, which is really, let's say, broken down between training and then inference jobs, there's a volatility around that hasn't really been fully captured or forecasted appropriately, right? And when I look at what's happening with these jobs within the white space of the data center, I sort of actually reminds me of like 10 years ago with the duck curve, right? When all the solar, was being deployed, people were putting it on their roofs. And then, you see this duck curve where no one's home pre-COVID. And then they come home and they all of a sudden light up the house and you see this crazy volatility. But what ends up happening is like, it's pretty predictable, right? So when you bake in flexibility, energy management, resourcing from power, right? Like where should the power come from? It started to really create its own profile. And so when we look at the similar sort of patterns of these different jobs, so LLMs versus inference, right? There's sort of like a duck curve that we're creating internally. And so what that allows us to do is forecast the power requirements based on compute because we have a pretty good sense of when do people start, asking ChatGPT about, I don't know, the Dodgers, right? I'm a local LA guy, right? Baseball, what happened? Did Shohei Ohtani just do something incredible? So you see these spikes, right? And so in aggregate, our AI would capture that. So then the point with that then is if you have a pretty good sense of like how the compute is being allocated on premise, right? Then what can you do to, throw power at it, right? Whether it's driving up more compute or even, overlaying specific precision cooling to again unleash a little bit more productivity within each zone. So what ends up happening is like, just ballpark numbers, a lot of these data centers, these are sort of the non-hyperscale data centers that are, probably utilizing at 40%. So you're looking at 60% headroom. You can probably never get to 100%, at least right now, but you could probably get to 50, 60% without without violating SLAs or just having everything fall apart. Now, if you do that, you could look at it two ways, right? One is from a data center perspective, you're better utilizing your power and your compute, which is more productivity, which is more revenue, more token production per square foot, however you want to structure it. The flip side, which we're also very much involved with, is it's also a way to provide flexibility to the grid. So if you look at it, you're basically synthetically increasing more compute based on the allocated power envelope, which is basically a synthetic growth in power. And so that's one of the ways that we look at it. And because we're, part of LG and we do a lot of work around cooling, the ability to do precise cooling is one of the biggest levers, right, in terms of unleashing more data center productivity. And that's what flexibility is to us fundamentally. It's sort of again power, cooling, and then GPU utilization.
Okay, and maybe you can just expand a little bit in terms of how the
Mhm,
software platforms such as yours can help the data centers
mhm,
optimize energy use whilst also balancing things like grid power. We talked
mhm.
about the renewables, storage, and backup systems. So how easy or difficult is it to get everything in sort of optimized balance as as far as you can?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Maybe the simplest. I'll give you a two-phase sort of example of like the work we do. So one simple example would be there's sort of a job coordinator, right? So the folks at the data center, they're putting in jobs into a queue, like a workload management platform. And so it's kind of FIFO, right? Like first in, first out. So there's no like organization on the front end. It's like, hey, I got a job, just put it in the queue, right? So it could be a massive training job. It could be a little tiny, inference job. It could be 10 million inference jobs in sequence. It's all over the place, but it's basically first in, first out, right? So now what happens with that, because every job is different, right? The way to look at it is you have sort of a bucket or a bottle, right? And you're dropping in stones, pebbles, sand, right? They're all different sizes, but what ends up happening is when that bottle is full, you got all these air gaps, right? And I sort of look at that as like that is the underutilization. So that's sort of that 70% underutilized, meaning you have this capacity, you have power, you have things to do with it, but it's just not well organized. And it also aligns with the forecast, right? So now that bucket is also aligned to a cooling zone. So let's say you're in a data center, you got 6 zones, and you just have you're just filling up these bottles, right? And you have complete underutilization of your compute, your power, et cetera. What we do is we unpack those rocks and the sand and reallocate it based on cooling zones, right? So that hey, this is only inference jobs. It's a lot of sand, right? But we're at 70%. This other one's giant LLM jobs, big old boulders, right? So there's still, ability to say, hey, it's not super mission critical. We could defer it a little bit. So we don't have to cool so aggressively on and on. And so what ends up happening is that if you're at 30% utilization synthetically with repacking and what we do, we can probably get you up to 50, 55% without impacting your uptime, without any violations on SLAs, things like that. And what ends up happening is that net, we've reallocated jobs, we've reallocated cooling. So net, your total consumption of power is probably equivalent or maybe a little bit less to do the same amount of work. And the flip side on the back end of that then too is that because we work with the operator to get a sense for like what are mission critical high priority jobs versus what are like a little latency is not that big of a deal, we can sort of temporally and spatially shift the jobs, right? Assuming that it complies, so that you provide even more flexibility. So that's kind of how we do it, right? And I'm trying to oversimplify it just to visualize it, but the complexity of tracking, tagging, and reorganizing all these jobs is like, pretty monumental. And people joke like we actually use our AI to help manage their AI, right? So it's almost
Yeah,
this like circular sort of journey that we're taking. Yeah.
yeah. And I'm also wondering, I mean, clearly the industry, you've got the regulators on
Hmm.
one side, and then we've got the consumers, which I think you referenced
Hmm.
at the start of, start sort of increasingly scrutinizing the
Hmm.
environmental impact of data centers and obviously the AI infrastructure in particular. So have you got any thoughts as to how data center operators need to rethink their approach to energy management, or can they carry on as they are, or do they have to make sure that they are, you know, taking steps to demonstrate more energy efficient running of the facility and the compute
Hmm.
within.
Yeah, wow, there's a lot there. So let me start with sustainability, right? Because I know that's meaningful for you and your audience, but also for myself. Um, you know, I think the thing about sustainability is just not, I mean, we in the industry we talk about it, right? And we kind of throw it under the rug a little bit. Um, but I think it's one of those things where like it'll be an existential crisis for the industry, the community, regulators, everybody, right? Because if we keep going down the path of saying, hey, there's like two paths here, right? Grid connected and non-grid connected behind the meter side of things, what you're going to do is really, you're going to destroy all the progress I think that we've made to date, right? Both from a regulatory perspective, but like true impact, right? In terms of carbon. And so the thing about that then is, there has been some work being done in terms of standardizing some of the metrics around carbon reporting and things like that. But also, like, in the past, the SEC required public companies to kind of disclose their mitigation sustainability plans and things like that. I don't think I don't know if it's the SEC or the DOE or whoever, they're not really prosecuting that right now. But there's an element where, like, those types of regulations I think are very important, right? Because unconstrained growth yields unconstrained damage, right? And we need to be able to balance that. So that's just one thing I would say that, would be interesting to keep your eye on. Now, when it comes to the rest of it, you see things like, and I can't remember, I think maybe it was Anthropic. They were talking about, hey, we're going to cover all the costs of, the rate increases so that it doesn't sort of slip into the ratepayers and things like that. Got to be careful with that narrative, right? And that rhetoric, right? Because fundamentally, they're paying for it anyways, right? Because they need to work with the developer to kind of create that infrastructure. And if it is grid connected, right, then yeah, it's, there's elements there that they do have to subsidize. If it's not, they're covering it anyways. So there's elements of, like, you got to kind of weed through what that narrative looks like. But fundamentally, I mean, it's a really tricky question of how the industry is going to grow. One of the things that I would say, though, that I'm very proud to say that we're part of is EPRI's DC Flex. If you're familiar with EPRI,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So,
No, I did an
they
interview
do
with
a
them and last couple of weeks ago, I think. But yeah.
Oh, okay, great. So, EPRI, they do a lot of great work, and they're, I would just say, probably one of the leading voices in terms of creating really strong, sustainable blueprints for growth and innovation, right? They did great work with solar. Now they have a working group called DC Flex, Data Center Flex, with the intent of, bridging, the relationships between utilities, operators, hyperscalers, third-party vendors, you name it, the entire stakeholder network for this stuff to create something that actually, unifies us and creates better solutions globally. So not just US, but all over the place. And I really appreciate that because it's diligent, it's rigorous, right? And it's one of those situations where it's not a zero-sum game, right? Like, it's like everyone has to compromise, everyone has to contribute to find a way to win. And so with that, you create these blueprints for scale, right? Like, this is actually how you do it. And what ends up happening is, like, sustainability is baked in. Intelligent orchestration is baked in, right? Grid connected versus non-grid connected data center development is baked in. And so you create these different solutions that I think are important. And if we have that level of discipline and cooperation, at least here domestically, I feel like, we'll be on the right path. So.
Okay, yeah, I mean, perhaps we can neatly link to what I was going to ask next. So,
Mhm,
in terms of partnerships, we've got the sort of energy providers, we've got the
mhm,
technology platforms, and then the data center operators. So,
mhm,
so
mhm, mhm.
how important is their collaboration, whether it's renewable integration or just generally addressing the sort of energy management situation,
Mhm.
and particularly, I guess, at scale, which is the other thing that is not always easy.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. So, maybe to take a little bit of a step back and even a step back in time a bit, like me personally, my team mostly, like, we're software guys, right? We've been in sort of energy SaaS software for 15 to 20 years. And so you also remember, back in the day, I can't remember what year, but Mark Andreessen was talking about how software is going to eat the world and all that stuff, right? And
Yeah,
sort of that paradigm. And, like, we fully bought into it, right? Like, yes, we're software guys. It's like nothing can stop us. This industry is completely the opposite, right? This is where software pure play on its own, like, we're not even eating your breakfast, okay? Like, it's just like, this is the moment where hardware, silicon,
yeah.
all these, infrastructure companies have now, like, the light is on them. This is their time to shine, right? Like, they own the supply chain, they own the infrastructure. I look at us as a software and service provider as being, an ingredient. Like, we are a condiment in terms of this overall stack. Not to diminish, software companies, but the point is like the level of integration, collaboration is really important, right? And so, I think that's where I'll start, right? And I think that's really important. And so when it comes to how to scale and how to participate, I'll also add that, having been in the industry, a very long time, whether it's just the growth and power requirements, embedded large multinational companies pivoting, right, to create solutions around this growth market is nothing like I've ever seen before, right? I've never seen anything like it. And people say that a lot, but it's like it's really interesting. And for me, it's also incredibly exciting because I'm not directing my company into this red ocean where it's a race to the bottom, right? It's actually a race to like, to the top of Mount Olympus to try to figure out like what can we do to make a positive impact. The flip side is I also see these very large companies, and just to plug our parent company, LG, to pivot to say, like, we need to figure out how to be a better partner. We need to find a better way to go to market effectively so that we can make an impact in this space. And so we also have found that the partnership with these larger companies, across the board has been really, really great, right? And so, I just feel very optimistic about it. Yeah.
And do you think that at some stage, as you mentioned, you're using AI to,
Mhm,
sort of deliver the AI world? Do you think the
mhm,
software, I know, DSIM, I've followed DSIM since it first arrived and
mhm,
didn't deliver, and then, I can't remember which iterations. Do you think it is inevitable that at some stage the folks will get how important the software part of it is rather than just obsess
mhm,
with GPUs and cabinets
mhm.
and racks and all the rest of that stuff?
Yeah, I really do. And I'll give you a great example. Just again, my history in SaaS and energy SaaS, selling to utilities and things like that. I'm used to an environment where, let's say we have a potential customer. Let's just say it's a large utility, right? And we sell them a value model and opportunity to engage our software. They love it. Let's pilot it. And here the sort of the trope. It's like they'll pilot you to death and that kind of thing. And what ends up happening, it's not really the case. What it is the lead time from, hey, I just signed the contract to actually implementing and activating the solution is where the death occurs, right? Because oftentimes, I mean, we're talking, and there's different terms for it, but you could call it like non-recurring engineering or one-time setup costs. And that can take anywhere from 6 to 12 months, right? So think about it as a software company. You can't even recognize revenue or activate the solution for 6 to 9 months after you actually sign the contract. What I'm seeing with our solution, again, deploying our AI to collect the data, to clean it up, to test it, to validate it, to make sure that the outcomes that we would deliver as a software company are the right outcomes and aligns with their goals, the customer's goals. Like, we're literally shrinking that to 2 weeks. Okay. So for me, I look at it like I'm used to a 9 month ramp up, right? Before we get anything done, before we get paid, to 2 weeks. Okay. Like I can't even, like, that's the best example I could give you of like how incredible this is. And so, whether you're deploying AI to kind of, smooth out and improve your processes of onboarding a customer, or actually using it to kind of create the outcomes, you're talking about massive force multiplication using this technology. And so, and if you were to double down on that to say, hey, we have to do the same because now we're part of an overall broader technology stack. It could be from a system integrator, it could be from an EPC, it could be whoever, right? Hardware partner, things like that. It's the same paradigm, right? Like, we use these new tools to speed up the point of activation, and it just creates massive economic development and positive impacts. So hopefully that helps, but that's kind of the world we're living in right now, which is pretty great.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Maybe just in finishing,
Mhm.
just your thoughts as to some of the important best practices data center operators should be looking at if they want to operate. I mean, we're talking about a sort of tightening energy constraints, whether that's just availability of
Mhm.
power, regulation, etc. So they've
Mhm.
got that part of the equation, but they've also got to support this AI growth, which is, I won't say they're conflicting priorities, but they're not
Mhm.
necessarily completely aligned. So what sort of advice would you give to folks in terms of how they can navigate that future?
Yeah, yeah, no, I think great question. I mean, what I would say is, I think you mentioned DSIMs and stuff like that. I think historically there has been sort of like a gap or a chasm between the bridging between the gray space and the white space, right? And a lot of it's because it wasn't really that necessary. It's pretty predictable and things like that. And when you see the investments and the technology being deployed around liquid cooling and different cooling solutions, water management, things like that, the complete alignment between the gray space and the white space is like it is it is mandatory now. Like I truly that is the basis of what we do. It is mandatory. And I would say that when we do that, it actually unleashes so much value within the white space, right? Whether it's the job orchestration, whether it's, unpacking and packing jobs and aligning it with cooling, that's just the surface area, right? But you need to have that correlation with the gray space and whatever systems you're running to kind of do that. Otherwise, you're still just blowing into a big room, right? And the optimization doesn't really make sense. So that level of investment and that level of just saying, yeah, I think that's a thoughtful argument and we should be looking at ways to improve that. And what ends up happening is that it extends your lead time for time to power. Meaning, if I need more power, or I'm growing my existing site, or I'm breaking ground on a greenfield, right? Like it actually extends your power a little, or your lead time a little bit better. The second thing is that, internally, there's always questions about oversubscription and how do you manage that, right? It's a great way to provide more value to your tenants, but it's also a great way to basically drive your top line. This is also a way to do it synthetically by being more efficient with cooling. And, if you do a lot of that stuff, what ends up happening is that, whatever is in your pipeline, you could bring it up a little bit, and everything, the longer term pipelines in terms of new greenfield type things, you actually can balance the portfolio a little bit better. That's probably the way I would look at it. Maybe, again, that's our core DNA, cooling and things like that. So I'll maybe just stop there. Hopefully that's meaningful for you guys.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, it's been great to chat,
Yeah.
and thank you so much for
Mhm.
sharing so many great insights into what's going on. It's a fascinating time, as you said, for the industry. Very exciting, but also, yes, every day something new happens, doesn't it?
Mhm.
So, yeah, very fast moving. But really appreciate the time you give me, Wannie. So, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Great conversation. Appreciate it very much.